Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right in the back? Okay, great. Thank you. My name is Joe Snyder. Willie, when he was on to introduce Harry earlier, mentioned that I'd be coming on now. And I will be talking about, as you can see, about South Africa today. I wanted to introduce myself a bit. I spent 30 years as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, as a diplomat for the United States, mainly in Asia, Southeast Asia, other parts of Asia, and a little bit of time in Europe as well. After I retired from government service, I worked for 3 different organizations involved in foreign policy issues. So I've been following what's going on in the world all of my professional life. About 5 years ago, I finally retired. As my wife said, I flunked retirement and only succeeded on the 4th time. And started doing this, talking on ships. This is my first trip with Oceania, and I'm really looking forward to it. I must say, in the day and a half that we've been on the ship, or 2.5 days, I guess, I've been very impressed. I think this is a great line. So I'm really looking forward to this trip. Also, it's part of the world I haven't spent much time in, even though I'm going to talk about it. But I did spend a lot of my professional career looking at foreign policy of the entire world. I should warn you that I will be talking about some history. I'm going to do a little bit of what Harry's going to do. Hopefully we're going to not duplicate each other too much. I will talk about some of the countries we're going to, but most of my talks are going to be other kinds of topics that are relevant, some to this part of the world, some a little further afield. I've got to talk about Islam. I've got to talk about China, another one about India, even though we're not going to those countries. But they're important countries, and they're very important for this part of the world. And we'll do a couple of other things as well. Much of what I talk about is going to deal with history, and that's why this is the warning I wanted to give you. I'm not an academic. I don't have a PhD in history. So when I talk about history, I'm actually going to be practicing history without a license. But I think I've always felt that history is a very important part of understanding any country, and in the countries I lived in and worked in and the countries I worked on when I was stationed in Washington, it was always important to know quite a bit about the history of these places, so I will be talking about that. And one other thing I wanted to say, I want to somewhat sarcastically thank Harry for having me follow his first topic. I've never followed the Elephant Act before. And I can assure you, not going to be the Lion Act. But I hope you will. Hope you'll enjoy it. So let's begin. First of all, just a little bit of background information, the basics on South Africa. Here's a map of the country. It's a country of 1.2 million square kilometers. It's about twice the size of Texas. It is mostly a semi-arid Mediterranean type of climate with a subtropical climate up the east coast. The closer you get to the equator, it becomes more subtropical. Not tropical. It's not quite far from the equator. Here is probably the most salient thing to know about South Africa, and that is the composition of its population, the racial or ethnic composition of the population, because so much of what's happening, what has happened historically in the country, and particularly what's happening in the country today, is related to the question of race or ethnicity. And you can see the population is about 53 million. Although interestingly, a tour guide that we had, we actually went on a tour before the cruise started, mentioned that there may be as many as 60 million people in the country, not the 53 million of the latest census. And that's because there is a tremendous problem of illegal immigration into the country, mainly from other African countries, mainly black Africans coming into the country because it is the most prosperous, wealthy country in Africa, and a lot of people come here thinking that there is going to be better economic opportunities for them. And so this illegal immigration has probably brought the population up to a total of maybe 57, 58, maybe as much as 60 million people. But of those who were counted in the census, of the 53 million, you can see almost 80% of them are black Africans, and that's a term that's used in the country to describe those people who are natives of the continent. Then about almost 10% of the population are white, that is the descendants of the Europeans, mainly the Dutch and the British, but who historically ruled the country, but also of other ethnic groups who came in later, mainly from Europe. Then there's a group called the colored. I spelled it the way it's spelled here, even though I'm an American. Again, about 9%, and that is a distinctive group of basically mixed race people, and I'll talk a little bit more about them later. Under apartheid, colored was a legal term that was used when the law required that every person in the country be classified under one racial category or another. And then finally, a relatively small percentage, but significant number of Indians/Asians. These are people who are from South Asia. Most of them descendants of laborers who were brought in during the British time to work in, actually in cane fields in Natal, around the Durban area. Now, just to give you a sense, though, of how these populations are distributed, this map shows which racial group predominates in the various parts of the country. The red, or orange here, red on my computer, but orange here, this is where the black Africans predominate. And interestingly, on the eastern side of the country, this is the predominant racial group in most of the Western Cape province and the Northern Cape province are actually colored. Now, the whites tend to predominate in urban areas, as you can see here. And although you can't see it over here, the Indian or Asian tend to be concentrated around Durban over here in KwaZulu-Natal province over here. And there are some areas there's no dominant group. But to get another view of this, where the population lives, this map shows the population density. And this explains why the black African group is almost 80% of the population. Because they tend to be in the areas that are the most heavily populated over here. And the western side of the country, other than around Cape Town, is relatively sparsely populated. But the very heavily populated areas here in the east tend to be predominantly black African. Language is an important factor also in the country. These are, other than the other listed here, these are the official languages, 11 official languages in the country. And this gives you some sense of the ethnic groups that are in the country as well. The isiZulu is the language spoken by the Zulu people. isiXhosa, spoken by the Xhosa people. These are the majority languages. Then Afrikaans, as you can see, more than 13% of the country, and English, only 8.2% speak the language as the native language. But, of course, English is by far the most commonly used language by virtually everybody in the country. Not everybody speaks English, but it is spoken by almost everybody in the country. It is the predominant commercial language. It's the language that tends to be used more in the parliament. If you noticed around Cape Town, you saw advertising signs. They're almost entirely in English. Even though more people speak Afrikaans in the Cape Town area than speak English, the advertising tends to be in English. So you can see the importance of the English language, even though it's the native language of a relatively small percentage of the people. Now I'm going to plunge into the area where I'm practicing without a license and talk a little bit about South African history. Until about 500 AD, the southern part of Africa was inhabited by a Stone Age group of people called the Khoisan people. Relatively few in numbers. These were a Stone Age group of people called collectively the Khoisan. There were one group were the San. These were the hunter-gatherers, the most primitive of the group. A term, they were once called Bushmen by Europeans. That term is no longer used. The term San is used for them. And then the Khoi, or Khoi, were the herders. But again, a relatively primitive culture. They did not have agriculture. They did not have permanent settlements. They were herders who moved around. They were called by the Europeans in an earlier era, the Hottentots. I'm sure that's a term that you've heard. Again, a term that's not really used. So these were the people that predominated all over southern Africa, or in today's South Africa, in relatively few numbers. Not because they were not settled, because they tended to move around to hunt and gather berries and so forth, or to move their herds around. They were nomadic people that tended to move around. Then about 500 AD, a much more advanced group of Africans came in, speaking a number of different languages. The languages you saw there mostly belong to something called the Bantu language group. And so these are called Bantu people. Actually a term that's fallen out of use in South Africa, and I'll explain why a little bit later. But linguists talk about the Bantu language group. And these people began to arrive, as I say, about 500 AD, moving gradually into southern Africa. These were farmers as well as herders. They were much more sedentary people. They needed a good climate with enough rainfall to carry out their economic activity, which was largely farming. They did mix in with some of the Khoisan who were here before they came, but they mainly pushed the Khoisan to the western part of the country, and that accounts for that. The maps we saw, the most numerous people tended to stay in the part of the country with better rainfall, and the Khoisan were moved to the west. And mainly when the Dutch arrived, and I'll talk about that in a little while, the people that they encountered were the Khoisan, not so much the Bantu peoples who were confined to the eastern part of the country when they arrived. Now, that's sort of the history of the country before the Europeans arrived. The first Europeans to appear in South Africa were the Portuguese, and these were these explorers. I'm going to give a talk about the great explorers later on, so I won't go into too much detail. But Bartholomew Diaz, this is the red line here, coming out of the school of Prince Henry the Navigator, and the first of these great European explorers tended to be Portuguese, explored all the way down and around the Cape of Good Hope. The Portuguese were looking for an alternate route to the Indies so that they could bypass the middlemen, the Indians and the Arabs, who were the ones that brought the spices from the Indies and the Chinese goods, pottery and silks and so forth to Europe. The Europeans were looking for a way to get around the middlemen, and so that's what Diaz's trip was designed to do. He traveled in 1488, and then in Vasco da Gama passed the Cape on his way to India in 1497, and that's the green here. And he came around and was the first European to actually make the trip all the way to the east, and then later explorers went further on to Southeast Asia, to the Spice Islands, and then on up into China. Macau was founded by the Portuguese and so forth. But the Portuguese did not settle in what is today South Africa. They did establish settlements further north on both the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean coasts, but they did not actually settle in southern Africa. The Europeans who formed the first settlement in southern Africa were the Dutch. In 1652, this is 150 or more years after the Portuguese first rounded the Cape, a Dutch East India Company expedition led by a man named Jan van Riebeeck landed at Table Bay, that is at what is today Cape Town, and began a settlement that eventually did become the city of Cape Town. Now, the company at first did not plan to colonize southern Africa. They saw this town that they set up, which eventually became Cape Town, as a way station for their ships on their way to the Indies. You remember the Dutch basically took over all of what is Indonesia today. That became the Dutch East Indies. And these ships, there was no Panama, no Suez Canal, came around Africa. It was a very long trip, and they thought it was important to have a way station for replenishing water and wood and so forth. And so that's what Cape Town was originally set up to do. But more and more people started coming there. Settlers began farming and gradually began to move out from Cape Town and to encroach on the Khoisan people who were living there. And this had a devastating effect on the local people, the Khoisan. Many were forced into indentured servitude. Europeans had attitudes that Africans were inferior people and they could be made to work for the Europeans. And then the Europeans also brought with them, the Dutch brought with them, European diseases and European firearms. And both of these had a devastating effect on the Khoisan people, who were the original settlers and people who originally lived in this part of South Africa. The Dutch also imported slaves from Madagascar and from the Indies, from what is today Indonesia. And they often intermarried with the Dutch settlers. And there were also unions between the Dutch and the Khoisan people as well. And the offspring of these unions between the Dutch and the what are known as Malays, they're now called Cape Malays, some of them, and also the unions with the Africans, produced a group of people called the colored people. As I say, this is accepted as a different racial group in South Africa, and the colored population are the descendants of these mixed unions between Europeans and the people from Indonesia and Madagascar and the local Africans. They are, as you can see from this picture, quite a handsome group of people. And if you did any walking around Cape Town when you were here, I'm sure you may have noticed them. Very distinctly different from the black African population. The Dutch descendants of the original Dutch settlers, became known as Afrikaners, as they are still known today, or as Boers. Boer is the Dutch word for farmer. But these people were known as, are now known today, even today, as Afrikaners or Boers. Afrikaner is a more accepted term. These are a group of people who speak a language called Afrikaans, which is a form of Dutch. Of course, the descendants of the original settlers have been away from the Netherlands for hundreds of years, and languages evolve, and so Afrikaans is a distinct language now. Our guide on the tour that we took was an Afrikaner, and she said that she could understand Dutch but could not speak it, which I thought was kind of interesting. Her native language is Afrikaans. Another 150 years after the Dutch arrival, remember the Dutch didn't arrive till 150 years after the Portuguese arrived, another 150 years later, in 1795, because Napoleon's France occupied the Netherlands, the British began to get concerned that the French were going to take over the Cape Town colony, Cape Colony as it was called. And so they moved in and actually defeated the Dutch, who were running the colony at the time. And in 1795, the British came in and took by force of arms, took over the colony. And except for a brief period from 1803 to 1806, the Cape and all of the land surrounding it remained in British hands up until the more modern era. So you have the Dutch colonized for 150 years, then the British came in and began to colonize the area. And the British actually promoted settlement by people come from Great Britain of their new Cape Colony. The Dutch-speaking residents naturally resented the imposition of the English language and culture on them. And this began a movement of the Dutch, many of the Dutch, Afrikaners or Boers, out of Cape Town, out of the Cape Colony, and began to move into the interior, moving north and moving east. This process was accelerated in 1834 when the United Kingdom abolished slavery in the Cape Colony. And the Dutch had relied very much on slaves. By this point, the British had outlawed slavery, the slave trade, outlawed slavery on British territory in other parts of the world. And the Dutch didn't feel the same way about it, so again they were further alienated, and this began what is known as the Great Trek. This is the movement of Afrikaans-speaking farmers north and east toward and into territory of the Bantu-speaking natives. These are the much more culturally developed people who occupied the eastern part of the country. And you can see from this map they actually went quite far. These people who performed the Great Trek are known as Voortrekkers or pioneers. They crossed the Orange River, which is right down here, leaving the Cape Colony, which was the boundary of the Cape Colony at the time, and moved into various parts of the country, as you can see, all over much of the rest of what is today South Africa. When they arrived, particularly when they arrived, and this thing sometimes wants to act up. and it's still acting up. Anyway, when they arrived, you can see where they came together in one place and then began to spread out. As they began to spread out, they arrived in an area that seemed to be uninhabited land. There didn't seem to be any people there. Well, the reason it was uninhabited was that there had been a decades-long disruption caused by fighting among the Bantu-speaking people, particularly the rise of the Zulu nation under the great king, chief Shaka, who was quite a warlike man who and developed certain innovations in warfare and began to spread the people out from, I've got to get this to fix. There we go. Well, one more time. This is the area where the Zulu, the native Zulu people are, and it's where they are today. But he began to spread out into other parts of the country, and there's this period of widespread chaos and warfare known as the Mfukane, and it resulted in the death of thousands of native Africans. And thus, when the Afrikaners arrived, the Voortrekkers arrived, they found what this was apparently empty land, and of course began to take it over. They met more resistance as they moved closer to the Zulu homeland at the time of Shaka, this warlike people. And there was considerable fighting with the Zulus and other natives in the area. But the Boers eventually established inland republics known as the Transvaal, or the South African Republic up here, and the Orange Free State. These were independent countries established by the Afrikaners. There were a couple of others as well. They were not as long-lasting as these two. And so that was one movement outside the Cape Colony. The other one was the British establishing a new colony over here in Natal, next to Zululand. And Natal was separate from Zululand for quite a while. But that became a new British colony, separate from the Cape Colony, governed separately from the Cape Colony. This was an area that was ripe for growing sugarcane, but the Zulu did not take very well to working in the cane fields. It was terrible work and quite different from their traditional agriculture. So the plantation owners began to import Indian workers, Indians largely Tamil-speaking Indians from the southeastern part of India, and some from Ceylon as well, today's Sri Lanka. And over 50 years, 150,000 Indian laborers came into Natal, leading to the largest expatriate Indian community in the world. By 1893, when Mohandas Gandhi, the great leader of Indian independence, arrived to practice law in South Africa, Indians actually outnumbered the whites in the Natal province. Then you had a period of fighting and discord between the British and the Afrikaners in the two Dutch republics. What first set this off was the discovery of diamonds at a place called Kimberley, and that's marked on the map there. You can see this led to a huge diamond rush. 50,000 new arrivals came into the Kimberley area in 5 years, of all kinds, Africans, coloreds, and whites, all moved in, drawn by the lure of the wealth to come from the discovery of diamonds in that part of the world. And after the discovery of diamonds, the British extended their colonial influence by annexing Basutoland, today's Botswana, which is right here, and they actually annexed Transvaal, not the Orange Free State here, but they did annex Transvaal. And the Boers first accepted the British annexation of Transvaal because they were at that point still fighting with the Zulus. And it was they felt that having the British come in would help to protect them from the Zulus, and indeed it did help. Then there was a series of fighting between the British and the Zulus, known as the Anglo-Zulu War, which after very tough fighting, the British finally defeated the Zulus in 1879. This is a picture of a famous battle called Rorke's Drift, and if you've ever seen the movie Zulu, it's all about the Battle of Rorke's Drift. A very interesting movie, but eventually the British firepower overcame the tactics used by the Zulu warriors, and the fighting then stopped. Well, as soon as the fighting stopped, the Boers in Transvaal then rebelled against the British overlords in what is known as the First Boer War, which was quite a short-lived war, only from December 1880 to March 1881. And the Boers used guerrilla tactics against the professional army. And in fact, the Boers won that war, particularly this Battle of Majuba Hill, which was a great victory for the Boers against the British. So you had this first Boer War in which the Afrikaners won, and the British then gave up their claim to Transvaal, other than they did work out a deal where the British maintained suzerainty and responsibility for foreign affairs, but Transvaal became internally self-governing as a part of the British Empire, but very much on their own. Then you had the discovery of gold. This is the second big economic factor that affected South African history. In 1886, there was a gold rush in an area called Witwatersrand, which is near today's Johannesburg. And again, large numbers of people came in. And within 10 years, Johannesburg was the largest town in South Africa. The lure of gold proved even stronger for the British than diamonds had 20 years earlier. And they began to move people in. You remember, they were controlling the foreign policy of Transvaal, and there were not enough Afrikaners who had the right skills to operate a gold mining industry. And so a large number of British began to move into Transvaal, which was, of course, a Boer republic. And this led to renewed tensions between the Dutch and the British settlers, and led to what is now known as the Boer War, or the Anglo-Boer War, as our Afrikaner guide called it. This began in October of 1899, just before the turn of the century. And the fighting was quite ferocious. It started off quite well for the Boers. They laid siege to a number of British cities, Mafeking here, Kimberley down here, and then over in Natal as well. But the British, as you can see, began gradually to increase their forces in the area, including bringing in forces from all over the empire. There were Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians fought alongside the British in the Boer War, and they gradually drove the Boers back and finally captured the capital of Transvaal in June of 1900, the capital of Pretoria, which is still the capital today. So that was from October of 1899 to June of 1900. The problem is that didn't end the fighting. A nasty guerrilla war continued for 2 more years. The Boers harassing the British Empire forces, and the British began to employ what became known as scorched earth tactics, that is, destroying Boer farms, destroying crops that were growing, and herding people, both Boers and black Africans, into what the British called concentration camps. It was actually the first use of the term concentration camps. And here's a picture of one of them. They were quite pitiful conditions, and large numbers of people, particularly women and children, died in these concentration camps. So it was really nasty fighting, and all of this clearing the land and putting people into these miserable conditions in concentration camps. The Boer forces finally surrendered in May of 1902. The 2 Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, were absorbed into the British Empire, but they were promised self-government in the future. And this self-government came in the form of the Union of South Africa. UK Parliament passed the South Africa Act. This is the British Parliament, not the South African Parliament, in 1909. And the Union of South Africa became a dominion within the British Empire, self-governing in the same way that Australia, New Zealand, and Canada at an earlier period had gained dominion status, which allowed them to govern themselves with foreign policy and military affairs in the hands of the British. And in the new Union of South Africa, there were basically four states. There was the Cape Colony down here, which you can see occupied a very large part of the country. Natal, the former British colony here, which by then had absorbed Zululand. The Orange Free State, and the Transvaal over here. This was Basuto land, this is Swaziland. Both of these remained independent African native kingdoms under the protection of the British. They were not part of the Union of South Africa, and today they are not part of South Africa. They are independent countries as well. When the country was established, there, of course, was a dispute over where to locate the capital, because the Boers wanted the capital to be up in their part of the country, and the British wanted the capital to be in Cape Town, which had been the capital of the Cape Colony. The result was a compromise that actually still exists today. That is, the administrative capital of the country is in Pretoria, and that's sort of considered the capital. It's where most embassies are located. But the Parliament meets in Cape Town. I don't know if many of you may have had tours of Cape Town and saw the Parliament building near the Company Gardens there. So you've got this government moving. For when the Parliament's in session, the whole government moves down to Cape Town. And then in Bloemfontein, which is the capital of the Orange Free State, became the judicial capital where the highest courts are located as well. Natal was given financial compensation so that they didn't get a capital. But this rather strange system was set up, and again, it's still in operation today. English and Dutch became the official languages of the country, the new country. Later, Afrikaans was substituted for Dutch as the official language. And full independence for the Union of South Africa did not come until 1931, when the UK Parliament passed the Statute of Westminster, which gave complete independence to not only to South Africa, but to Australia, New Zealand, and Canada as well. So that was when South Africa became an independent country. During World War I, South African forces had occupied German Southwest Africa, what is today Namibia, and they were granted a League of Nations mandate when the war was over, and essentially South Africa incorporated Southwest Africa into South Africa, and you'll see later on it was a cause of some dispute between the various countries. South Africa also participated on the Allied side in World War II, particularly fighting in North Africa and in Italy. And this was despite a considerable amount of resistance by the Boers, or the Afrikaners, who tended to be much more pro-German than the British settlers, the British English-speaking citizens of the Union of South Africa. Nonetheless, South Africa did enter the war on the Allied side, and the Prime Minister at the time, Jan Smuts, who was himself an Afrikaner, became a major figure. He had actually he was Prime Minister twice he was actually a fighter for the Boers during the Boer War, the Anglo-Boer War, but then became very much an advocate of British, of the system that was set up under the Union of South Africa, was Prime Minister the period around World War I, and then was also the Prime Minister during World War II, and in fact was sort of named as the person who would succeed Churchill if anything had happened to him during the war. He would have become the Prime Minister of Great Britain, even while he was Prime Minister of South Africa. He was a really great man, very, very much admired. He also was very much responsible for the establishment of the United Nations at the end of World War II. And just to complete the kind of constitutional history of South Africa, in 1960 there was a referendum in which the people decided, of course the only people voting were white people at the time, decided to repeal the South Africa Act, and South Africa became a republic. That is, up until 1961, when the change was made, the monarch of Great Britain was also the head of state of South Africa, but South Africa became a republic in 1961. And at the same time, not because it became a republic, but because the Commonwealth was going to basically kick South Africa out because of the apartheid policy, South Africa quickly withdrew from the Commonwealth and left the Commonwealth. So that sort of completes the constitutional history. Now I want to talk about apartheid. Because it's, as you know, a very important factor in South Africa, in the history of South Africa, with consequences that exist today. From the beginning of European colonial rule in South Africa, both custom and legislation put native Africans in a subordinate position to the white rulers. Until 1833-34, slavery was legal in the South African colonies, and there were not only black African slaves, but also the slaves that had been brought by the Dutch in an earlier period from the Indies. Legislation also restricted the freedom of black unskilled workers. There was one exception, though. It's very interesting, and something I hadn't realized until I started doing research for this. Something was known as the Cape Qualified Franchise existed. Beginning in 1853 in the Cape Colony, and only in the Cape Colony, not in the other parts of what is today South Africa, there was a voting system that did not discriminate on the basis of race. It discriminated on the basis of property holdings. Therefore, what it meant was only those people who owned property could vote and participate in the political life of the Cape Colony. But there was no restriction on race. Now, of course, what this meant was that most of the voters tended to be white. They were the wealthier people, but they actually accepted the idea of native landholding, which is somewhat different from modern land rights. And so a fairly significant number of both blacks and colored were allowed to vote in the Cape Colony starting in 1853. Here is a picture of the opening of the first Cape Parliament. And if you look very carefully, you can see here's one black face here and perhaps down in here. So there were a number of non-whites participating in the political life of the Cape Colony. Over time, though, those rights were gradually whittled away. The property qualifications were changed. They were made stiffer, although the law didn't specifically change actually until after apartheid came in. But the ability of non-whites to vote in the Cape Colony or the later Cape Province gradually withered away, and by the 1950s, there was no longer participation by anybody but whites in the political life of the Cape Province. Then you had the beginning of apartheid per se. The term was not used before the ascendancy of the Afrikaner-dominated National Party, who were elected to power for the first time in 1948. There had been discrimination against non-whites in the country, for sure, and they were in a subordinate position. But apartheid was a wholly different thing, and it only began in 1948 when the National Party was elected. And they were elected on a platform of establishing apartheid, basically, a widespread system of formal segregation in the country. And of course, elected by a largely, almost entirely white electoral population. The new government passed a number of apartheid laws, and I want to run through some of them because they're kind of interesting to know the details of what apartheid meant. There was a Population Registration Act which formalized racial classification and introduced an identity card for all persons over the age of 18, specifying which racial group they belonged to. Before that, there had been kind of an informal system of racial classification, but it became formalized under apartheid. There was something known as the Group Areas Act, specifying where people could live on the basis of their race. And this led to a lot of people being removed from places where they traditionally lived when an area was declared a white area or a black area or a colored area or an Indian area. There was something known as the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, prohibiting marriage between persons of different races. And particularly obnoxious was the Immorality Act, which made sexual relations with a person of a different race a criminal offense under apartheid. There was something called the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act, which you see in this picture here, a result of it, creating separate beaches, buses, hospitals, schools, and universities for the various races. And then the Bantu Education Act, which created a separate system of education for African students. And for those of you from the United States, we had this question of, in some states in the United States, separate but equal school systems for whites and blacks in the United States on a much more concentrated basis throughout the entire country. Apartheid did the same thing. And then they had the Bantu Authorities Act, which created separate government structures for blacks and whites. A first step in a process that eventually led to the establishment of what were known as Bantustans. These were nominally independent homelands, the only places where blacks could hold citizenship, and therefore the only place they could vote. And this left South Africa then with a white majority. Coloreds and Indians retained their citizenship of South Africa once these Bantustans were set up. But the blacks were no longer citizens of South Africa, had to take the citizenship of these Bantustans. And you can see on this map, and the one I'm going to show next, what a small percentage of the country's land was devoted to these Bantustans. Here is a map similar to what we showed earlier, where the races predominate in different parts of the country. The gray are the Bantustans. It was only 13% of the total land area, but 75 to 80% of the population was meant to be concentrated in these places as the places which were their homes, where they had citizenship. They were allowed to travel under restrictions to work in areas outside the Bantustans, but they were the only place they could claim citizenship was in these rather small and in many cases scattered homelands or Bantustans. There were 10 of them were set up. Only 4 were ever granted formal independence. These were Transkei down here, the Xhosa people living here, Bophuthatswana up here, which is a lot of different pieces here, Ciskei down here, and Venda up here. They were actually formally granted independence by South Africa. They were only recognized, though, by South Africa and the other Bantustans, and interestingly, Israel. Israel had a rather strong relationship with South Africa in this period. Both of them, I think, feeling ostracized from much of the rest of the world. And even the Israelis didn't grant full diplomatic relations to these Bantustans. This led, of course, to the forced removal of tens of thousands of people of all races. Mainly, though, the blacks were forced to leave their homes and move into these areas. And so what you had was the segregation under apartheid was amazing. The population was divided into 4 groups, very highly specified what the conditions were for belonging to each one of these 4 groups: the black, the white, the Indian, and the colored. Strict segregation was enforced in most areas of life: education, hospitals, transportation, trade unions, recreation. Blacks were required to carry these passes to work in white areas. As I say, they were allowed to move into white areas to work and live there, although they were not citizens of living in the white areas. And blacks were not allowed to employ whites. Coloreds and Indians were also separated from the whites, but had a few more rights than the blacks did under apartheid. But both the coloreds and the Indians were given limited voting rights in 1983 in South Africa. But the blacks, of course, were not citizens of South Africa, could only vote in their homelands. Now, there, of course, was great resistance to apartheid, both inside the country and outside the country. The African National Congress, which is the ruling party today, was founded in 1923, but it was largely ineffectual until the mid-40s, and particularly after the establishment of apartheid. After the establishment of apartheid, the African National Congress became the main organization opposing apartheid. They operated in association with the Communist Party of South Africa and with the Confederation of Trade Unions, known as COSATU, Confederation of South African Trade Unions. These 3 operated as a group together, fighting apartheid. And the way they fought apartheid, there were several different ways. One of them was violence. They established something known as Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, or MK, from the sounds of the first word, Umkhonto. It was formed in 1961 as the military wing of the ANC, following something known as the Sharpeville Massacre, in which 69 blacks were killed by South African security forces during a demonstration. The MK carried out a series of bombings against South African government or all-white installations. The result was that the ANC and the Communist Party were banned as terrorist organizations, including by the United States. Many ANC leaders, including Nelson Mandela, were jailed at this time for subversion against the state. Many other ANC leaders went into exile to carry on the fight from other countries, mainly neighboring countries, but many of them in Europe as well. And the MK not only used violence against the government and against white installations, but against some blacks if they were deemed not sufficiently militant. particularly against a party known as the Inkatha Freedom Party, Zulu-based party that competed with the ANC in the Natal province. And so the ANC not only fought against the government, but also against some of the blacks as well. Also, external opposition to apartheid. The United Nations passed a series of resolutions. In 1962, the General Assembly condemned apartheid. General Assembly where there was no veto power. The Security Council, which did have veto power, in 1963 called for a voluntary arms embargo against South Africa. In 1974, the General Assembly voted to expel South Africa from the UN, but the resolution was vetoed in the Security Council by the US, Britain, and France, who thought that that was too strong a punishment to use against South Africa because of apartheid. But in 1977, the Security Council did pass a resolution making the arms embargo mandatory. At various times, the General Assembly, the larger group in the UN, recommended a trade embargo against South Africa, but it was never made mandatory because of American and European opposition. Nonetheless, by the late 1980s, the US and most Western European countries had imposed trade sanctions on South Africa. There were campaigns for disinvestment, for companies to bring their investment out of South Africa, or they'd be boycotted in the U.S. and Canada and Europe as well. These disinvestment campaigns were quite widespread. And then, what may have been the most effective form of opposition to apartheid in the world was that because South African laws prohibited multiracial teams, a number of international and national sporting organizations boycotted South Africa. The International Olympic Committee barred South Africa from the 64 and 68 games, and in 1970, South Africa was formally expelled from the International Olympic Committee. Restrictions or bans were placed on South Africa participation in competitions, international competitions in rugby, cricket, soccer, tennis, as you see here, and other sports. South Africans have told me, meeting a number of them on ships and elsewhere, that the sporting bans were probably the most effective international action against apartheid in what was then and still is rather a sports-mad country. So kind of interesting that I've been told that that's what really caused the ruling party, the National Party, to rethink apartheid. Apartheid began to actually to weaken towards the end of the apartheid era. For one thing, the South African government began to use violence against the African National Conference in very brutal ways, and there was a lot of assassination of various ANC leaders by the government. The economy, of course, plummeted in the late 80s as a result of sanctions and the violence that was going on in the country. And several of the minor apartheid laws were eased or repealed in the late 1980s. But the election of F.W. de Klerk in late 1989 really changed things. Quietly, the government had been reaching out to the ANC before he was elected to look at what could be done to deal with the situation that nobody was happy with. And when he became president, the pace of change became breathtaking. In his opening address to Parliament in February of 1990, de Klerk announced that he would appeal the apartheid laws and lift a 30-year ban on the African National Congress, on the Communist Party and other apartheid groups. So only a couple of months after he was elected, he announced this change. Mandela was released on February 11th, 1990, after 27 years in prison. There's this iconic picture that we've all been seeing in the last month or so during the commemoration of Nelson Mandela's passing. On March 21st, 1990, Southwest Africa, which had been the German Southwest Africa, had been absorbed by South Africa, was granted its independence by de Klerk, again, very soon after he took over office. This was another sore point with the rest of the world. And apartheid was then dismantled in a series of negotiations between the government and the ANC between 1990 and 1993. Interestingly, the negotiations caused a backlash among some diehard whites in the country who thought that that apartheid should stay and that the country could weather that storm. But de Klerk called a whites-only referendum in 1992 on continuing negotiations, and de Klerk won 68% of the vote. That is, 68% of the white population said, we've got to do something about this, continue negotiating, let's change the situation in our country. In 1993, before the first fully democratic election, Mandela and de Klerk received the Nobel Peace Prize for their work they had done in bringing about the new democratic order in South Africa. And then at midnight on April 27th, 1994, the old South Africa flag was lowered and a new flag was raised. The first democratic election was held on April 27th, 1994, and was carried out peacefully. In spite of the fact that this is a very sensitive situation, there were going to be major changes taking place for everyone. The election was carried out peacefully. The ANC won almost 63% of the vote, and they won 252 of 400 seats in Parliament. The old National Party, the old Apartheid Party, got most of the white and colored vote and became the official opposition party. On May 10th, 1994, Mandela was sworn in as the president. The government of national unity was formed with 12 ANC representatives, 6 from the National Party, from the old Apartheid Party, and 2 from the Inkatha Freedom Party, which was the other black party dominated by the Zulus. So you had a government of national unity that came in and began the new era in South Africa. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up to deal with the legacy of apartheid and the struggle for liberation and the violence that took place on both sides. The idea was to bring to light abuses that occurred on both sides, but to avoid retribution for those abuses. In other words, bring them to light, have people talk about them, talk about the suffering that they had, but not to use this as a form of judicial punishment. That is basically to remember the past, but not to gain retribution for what happened in the past, because there were problems on both sides during the struggle to end apartheid. And this commission actually, although it had many problems, became a model for other countries to deal with their past. For instance, in Sri Lanka, which we'll talk about later, Harry and I will both be talking about, there's a similar Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's been set up to deal with the violence that has plagued Sri Lanka in recent years. So we're back to Africa, South Africa today. The new constitution contained strong guarantees of personal liberty. That was actually quite a remarkable constitution. The freedoms that are granted to the citizens of South Africa are quite broad. One of the consequences of that was that the whites were allowed to keep their dominant position in the economy. And even to this day, the economy is dominated by this white minority of the country. Just a second. In 1994, South Africa had Africa's highest per capita income, and the decision not to confiscate the wealth of the white minority has meant that South Africa is still the richest country in Africa. And South Africa is proud to be counted among the 5 BRICS. That is, these are the formal grouping of the 5 largest fast-growing economies in the world. That is, and the BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. South Africa is included not because it's as large and economically important as the other 4 countries, but because it was felt that there should be really an African country represented in this particular group. South Africa is also a member of the G20, of the group of the major economies of the world, that's sort of come to replace the G8 as the place where heads of government get together to look at what can be done about solving the world's economic problems. Now, under the new order, laws were enacted that required employment and educational affirmative action to give blacks greater participation in the economy. And the whole idea, particularly on the economic side, the main instrument that was set up was known as Black Economic Empowerment, or the B program. Here's a logo of the B program. Now, what's happened, unfortunately, under the B program is that those people in the black elite who have political power are the ones who have benefited most from the new order. And here's a local cartoon that gives the view of an awful lot of people, both white and black, about the Black Economic Empowerment Program. And you can see a few people gaining advantage, economic advantage, and the vast majority of people not benefiting. Now, since 1994, the government has given free houses to 2.5 million poor black families, and more than 15 million people get government welfare grants. Electricity and running water have come to millions of black homes for the first time, and the average annual income of black households has almost tripled from 2001 to 2011. And a growing percentage of the black adult population now has gone to high school and even to college. So there have been some very significant advances under the new regime for the black population in the country, but not enough. Almost half of South Africa's black population is unemployed, and even more workers are underemployed. I'm going to try to explain this because this doesn't show half the population is unemployed. This is 2008 to 2012, showing formal unemployment in the country as a whole is down around 25%. A broader definition of unemployment brings the number up to well over 30%. And then there's an expanded definition that brings the unemployment rate up well over 35%. Here is a somewhat earlier period, but this, you can see this. This is the average unemployment rate of around 30%, and it went up after this period as well. And this is the narrower definition. This is down here. And here's the black unemployment rate at the official lower definition of unemployment, well over, almost up to 40%. So in effect, if you take the standards that were applied here to a broader definition of unemployment, in fact, the black unemployment rate is up there around 50%. So not a particularly good situation for the vast majority of the country. Income inequality, which was already bad under apartheid, is growing. And this is something called the Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality. Again, this thing is not working. Zero is a country that has perfect equality. Everybody earns the same amount of money by the Gini coefficient. And the higher it gets, the more unequal is the distribution of wealth in the country. And you can see that South Africa from 1980 or earlier, the yellow, had a Gini coefficient of under 6. It's now well over 6. And here are a few other representative countries on the left, what the Gini coefficient has done. You can see most places income inequality has actually grown in most places in the world. In fact, it has it everywhere except Brazil on that particular chart. Another problem that South Africa has, like much of the rest of Africa, particularly Southern Africa, is AIDS. It's a huge problem here. About 18% of the adult population in South Africa is infected with AIDS. Now, not all of them have, well, the HIV rate is even higher, but those who actually have the AIDS virus is about 18% of the population. This was complicated by the way the government dealt with AIDS during the 1990s. The president who followed Nelson Mandela, a man named Thabo Mbeki, for years denied that AIDS was a problem, and he actively resisted putting into effect programs that could have dealt with the AIDS crisis. Eventually he came around. He served 2 terms, but eventually came around. But there was a lost period of about 8 years, 6, 7, 8 years, when South Africa could have done much more about its AIDS problem. Things are getting better now. It's under somewhat better control, but still 18% of the population is huge. Now the current president is this man, Jacob Zuma. He's a longtime ANC leader, but is a man who's been dogged all of his political career by allegations of corruption. His family has done very well under the B program, the BEE program, and even today there are problems. He built this magnificent house for himself using government funds, and said that most of these improvements that were done to the house were done for security reasons, including the water reservoir to guard against fires, otherwise known as his swimming pool. Uh, if you, if you, I guess most of us were home during the Nelson Mandela funeral rites. One of the really interesting things that happened, besides the fake signer who was doing sign language, was that when Zuma spoke, he was booed. You could quite clearly hear the people in the stadium. The stadium were mostly black South Africans. And it's because the government has really failed to fulfill the promise of the new democratic state in South Africa. Uh, for the longest time, the ANC in power, of course, could blame apartheid for the economic situation, but no longer. People are beginning to.
Very good afternoon to everyone. This is the captain speaking from the bridge, and I would like to give you some information about our present trip. It is 18 minutes past noon, and our position is latitude 34 degrees and 30 minutes south, with a longitude of 023 degrees and 33 minutes east. We are about 24 nautical miles south of the South African coast, and we have a course, an easterly course of 081 degrees. Since departing from Cape Town, we have covered a distance of 309 nautical miles, and we still need to go 248 nautical miles to reach East London Pilot Station. Our present speed is 16 knots, and as I said before, our course is an easterly course of 081 degrees. The winds are blowing from west-southwesterly direction at 25 knots speed rates. And we are experiencing also a swell, which is about 2 meters high and coming from east-northeasterly direction from the bow section. And it's about 6 feet, so 2 meters equal to 6 feet. Air temperature is 21 Celsius, equal to 69.8 Fahrenheit, and the sea temperature is 20 Celsius, equal to 68 Fahrenheit. We expect to be at East London Pilot Station tomorrow morning, sometime around 6 a.m., and to be alongside sometime around 7:15 a.m. Well, weather forecast is looking good in front of us. We'll have for tomorrow sunny, partly cloudy to sunny skies, with temperature ranging in the mid-80s, more or less 30 degrees Celsius. Thank you very much for your attention, and I shall see you all this afternoon at the reception party. Thank you very much.
I clearly went over my time. Let me just finish up very quickly. Elections are due in South Africa next year, sometime next year. And the ANC is still going to be the dominant party. They're going to almost certainly win the election, and Zuma is probably going to be reelected, in spite of the fact that he is quite unpopular among a certain segment, certainly among the whites and the colored, and a significant and probably growing number of the black population as well. But he's probably going to be reelected, which doesn't bode all that well for the country, because his leadership has really been lacking, and people are beginning to realize that. So there are lots of problems in the country. There's no question about it. Nobody is very happy with what's happening. The whites are not happy because there have been lots of changes that have taken place in the country, even though the white wealth has not been significantly affected by the new democratic government. The majority of blacks are not happy because the economic situation for most of them has not changed for the better, although many things have gotten better for a lot of people. Nonetheless, when half the people can't find jobs. Obviously, that's very significant. But the most important thing to remember about South Africa is that it made this change from this horrible system of apartheid into what is genuinely democratic country in which everyone enjoys voting rights, and it has been done peacefully. There's not been widespread violence at all. There have been incidents. Some trade union people were killed during a demonstration last year at one point. Nonetheless, it's been a remarkable transition, and I think in the end, South Africa is actually going to come out of this. It did the right thing, and even though there are going to be problems, I think it's going to eventually succeed. Thanks very much. I will be happy. We obviously have no time for questions, and it's time everyone needs to go to lunch. But I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Look for me around the ship. I'm telling the maitre d' we'd like to eat with as many people in the grand dining room as we can. If you have any questions, come up to me. Don't hesitate. I'm happy to talk to you about today's topic or, in fact, any other topic. Thanks very much.